analysts are saying that this offensive is coming at a high cost for Russia of lives.
And they're using what have been called meat grinding tactics.
Now, the number of identified Russian fighters killed on the front line in Ukraine has hit 70,000.
Moscow continues to use so-called meat grinder tactics, trying to wear down Ukrainian forces. As our count only includes deaths reported publicly, the true figure of losses is significantly higher.
Russian forces are being mutilated on the front lines right now. And honestly, calling it a meat grinder doesn't even come close to how horrific things have become. Ukrainian troops are now bringing back some ruthless Roman-era tactics. Methods so brutal they were originally designed to break cavalry charges, but they've adapted them to perfectly counter Russia's relentless waves of infantry. And the results are nothing short of devastating. For every single Ukrainian soldier lost, about 66 Russian soldiers are being slaughtered. You see, for months, Russia's been throwing absolutely everything it's got at the Ukrainian stronghold of Lyman, a strategic town they desperately needed to capture. But despite burning through thousands of soldiers, tanks, and mountains of artillery shells, they've made zero meaningful progress. Because the main route to Lyman runs through the Zherebrets River, and while they did manage to get troops across it months ago, those troops got stuck. They couldn't move forward because Ukrainian artillery was constantly hammering their positions, pinning them down and preventing any meaningful advance, and eventually taking back whatever little gains the Russians had made. So, out of sheer desperation, Russian commanders made a risky gamble. Instead of continuing their head-on assault at Lyman, they shifted their attention further south, to a small village named Torsk. If they could take Torsk, they'd open up another way around and finally be able to circle around behind Lyman and cut off its defenders. But what the Russians didn't realize was that the Ukrainians had anticipated exactly this scenario. Ukraine's 63rd Mechanized Brigade was waiting, even hoping, that Russia would make this very move. For months, this brigade had been meticulously preparing and setting up lethal traps inspired by brutal Roman-era tactics, then combining them with precision artillery and modern drone warfare. When the Russians finally came charging in, the battlefield quickly turned into an absolute bloodbath. Every time Ukraine lost one soldier, roughly 66 Russians were killed. That's a kill ratio of 66 to 1, which is, to put it bluntly, flat out insane. In modern warfare, numbers like this just don't happen. Yet, here we are. If Ukrainian tactics weren't brutal enough already, the landscape around areas like Lyman and Torsk is a nightmare on its own. To the north, there are huge reservoirs and marshy wetlands. This type of terrain completely blocked Russian troops from spreading out or trying to flank around Ukrainian defenses. Instead, they were forced straight into narrow paths, perfect choke points, exactly where Ukraine wanted them. Down to the south, the area around Torsk is covered by dense, thick forests. Ukrainians use this forest to their advantage by setting up hidden ambush spots, sniper positions, and concealing firing points. Ukrainians went so far as to dig up sections of road and build new pathways, ensuring Russian troops moved exactly where they wanted them to go. One look at the terrain around Torsk, and anyone with a shred of battlefield sense could have seen this was a death trap. Every one of these tactics is rewriting the rules of modern warfare. And if you think more people should see how Ukraine is doing it and why Russia can't stop it, hit like and subscribe. That one click helps push the story beyond the headlines and past the Russian propaganda. Now, maybe the Russian commanders were blind to it, or maybe they just didn't care. Either way, by the time the Russians finally realized their usual approach wasn't working, they'd already burned through most of their heavy equipment, tanks, armored vehicles, you name it. And it was far too late to turn things around. So the Russian commanders got even more desperate, and honestly, even more reckless. With their tanks and armored vehicles now destroyed, their new strategy was to send waves of infantry charging forward on motorcycles and ATVs, hoping that pure speed and chaos might help them break through before the Ukrainians could respond. But really, it only made things worse, and that's exactly when the kill ratio became so insanely high. Remember those nasty Roman-era traps I was talking about earlier? Let's slow down for a moment and look at exactly what makes these simple little spikes so devastatingly effective. They're called Calrops, a small weapon made up of 4 sharp spikes arranged in such a way that when you toss them on the ground, no matter how they land, one spike always points straight up. It's an incredibly simple design, but it's precisely why it's so deadly. The Ukraine's 63rd Brigade scattered thousands of these vicious little spikes across dirt roads, forest paths, and narrow trails, specifically targeting routes Russian troops were forced to take. In Roman times, armies would scatter these caltrops on battlefields and roads, crippling horses and stopping cavalry charges dead in their tracks. The spikes would pierce the horses' hooves, throwing riders violently to the ground, making them easy pickings for archers and infantry. Brutal then and equally brutal now. Better yet, the Ukrainians didn't just copy the Roman tactics, they improvised by using drones to precisely drop hundreds of these caltrops onto roads and trails just seconds before the Russian units arrived. Normally, scouts or drone teams would clear the route ahead, checking for landmines or other hazards. But these drone-deployed caltrops completely nullified that strategy. A road could look safe 1 minute and then literally seconds later become an invisible minefield of spikes. The Russians had no time to react, and no way to avoid what they couldn't see. The best part is that caltrops are ridiculously cheap and easy to manufacture. At one point early in the war, local blacksmiths who normally made medieval replica weapons as souvenirs switched to mass-producing caltrops from nails welded together. Unlike traditional mines, caltrops don't need explosives and are nearly impossible to spot from drones or thermal cameras. By the time Russian troops realized something was off, their tires had burst, their motorcycles had flipped, and soldiers were sent flying into the dirt, fully exposed to relentless Ukrainian machine gun and sniper fire. But to be fair, the Russian soldiers sent charging into these horrific traps didn't exactly have much of a choice. In the Russian army, refusing orders often comes with torture, imprisonment, or execution by your own commanders. With leadership like that, your options basically boil down to getting shot by the Ukrainians in front or by your officers from behind. On the rare occasions when Russian units actually manage to briefly grab a patch of trees or a forward position, Ukrainian drones spot them almost immediately. And before these Russian soldiers can even catch their breath, let alone dig trenches or set up defenses, they're hit with grenades dropped directly from drones overhead, along with mortar shells and artillery rounds fired from hidden Ukrainian positions nearby. The Russians got so desperate they even started wearing makeshift thermal cloaks, basically improvised blankets and coverings, hoping to mask their body heat from Ukrainian drones with thermal cameras. But the problem was, these cloaks were put together so poorly that they ended up doing the exact opposite. Instead of hiding the soldiers, these cloaks made them stand out even more clearly on thermal imagery. Faced with such hopeless odds, more and more Russian soldiers in the area are deciding it's smarter to surrender than keep running blindly towards certain death. They know very clearly that the chances of actually reaching Ukrainian trenches alive are virtually zero. So at this point, surrender is the only sane decision left. But why Lyman? Why spend 3 long years and sacrifice countless troops just to capture this small, seemingly ordinary town? Well, the truth is, the town of Lyman is a centerpiece for Russia's entire campaign in the east. Located right on the edge of the Donetsk Oblast, close to the Luhansk border, Lyman is a critical hub of roads and railways connecting the whole Donbas region. Control of Lyman means control over supply lines, troop movements, and the ability to push deeper into Ukraine's eastern territories. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022, capturing Lyman quickly became one of the highest priorities. Seizing the town would open pathways towards bigger strategic prizes, especially Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, 2 major cities crucial to the Donbas region. And because Lyman sits alongside this important river, whoever holds it also controls important river crossings, giving them significant defensive and logistical advantages. In fact, Russian forces did capture Lyman in May of 2022, but that victory didn't last long. Just a few months later, Ukrainian forces launched a counterattack, surrounded the Russian garrison, and recaptured the town by October 1st of 2022. That defeat was a massive embarrassment for Russia, especially since it happened just days after Putin boldly declared the annexation of Donetsk, including Lyman, as Russian territory. Ever since, the Russians have been obsessed with reclaiming it, desperate to redeem their losses and reopen the door into Donbas. This strategic importance is also why Ukrainian troops are doing everything they can to hold the town. But caltrops aren't the only old-school trick Ukraine has pulled out of history's playbook. Ukrainian soldiers have also rigged entire areas with classic booby traps, like tripwire-triggered grenades and hidden mines, exactly the kind of guerrilla-style war tactics we saw in Vietnam. In fact, many of the improvised methods we're seeing today in Ukraine's battlefields are echoes of tricks used decades or even centuries ago. But now, they've been updated, refined, and made even deadlier with a modern touch. For example, during the Vietnam War in the 1960s, Viet Cong guerrillas faced overwhelming US firepower. But instead of confronting America directly, they relied on clever, low-tech traps like punji sticks. These were sharpened bamboo spikes hidden in pits or carefully camouflaged along trails. Even worse, they often smeared these spikes with dirt, poison, or filth, causing severe infections once they pierced the feet or legs of unlucky American soldiers. Like the Calrops Ukraine is using today, punji sticks were incredibly cheap and required no fancy technology. Yet, they accounted for roughly 2% of all US combat wounds. And when combined with other traps and hidden explosives, they were responsible for nearly 15% of total American casualties in Vietnam. The main goal wasn't always to kill, but rather to injure, slow down, and demoralize enemy troops. One wounded soldier often required 2 or more comrades to carry him out, effectively removing multiple fighters from the battle with just a single injury. Soon enough, American GIs became extremely cautious about stepping off cleared paths, knowing the ground itself could be hiding spikes or hidden mines just waiting to explode. Ukraine's Calrops are having exactly the same psychological effect on Russian troops today. Another good example is from the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s. Back then, Afghan Mujahideen fighters frequently relied on old-school guerrilla warfare to bleed out and frustrate the massive Soviet military. Instead of standing and fighting out in the open, they set ambushes in mountain passes, very much like what Ukraine are doing today in forested terrain. The Mujahideen specialized in hit-and-run attacks against Soviet supply convoys, planted simple but effective roadside bombs, and used primitive, time-delayed explosives that later evolved into today's infamous IEDs. The Soviets entered Afghanistan with tanks and helicopter gunships as a conventional army, but found themselves frustrated by an enemy that refused to fight in the open, and instead used the terrain and tricks to their advantage. After a decade of constant losses and frustration, the Soviet forces withdrew, utterly defeated. Even the Romans themselves, known historically for their unbeatable discipline and brilliant engineering, sometimes fell victim to unexpected guerrilla tactics. In the year 9 CE, Germanic tribes cleverly lured Roman legions into dense, unfamiliar forests at Teutoburg, then ambushed and annihilated them completely. And decades earlier, at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, Parthian horse archers used hit-and-run tactics and fake retreats to confuse and decimate a much larger Roman infantry army. So yeah, having superior numbers or better technology doesn't always guarantee victory, especially when your enemy fights smarter, creatively, and uses the terrain to their full advantage. This is something Russia still hasn't learned, despite decades of experience in conflicts exactly like this. Ukraine is also using plenty of other unorthodox tactics, things like deception and decoys, so cleverly and effectively that they'd probably impress even the ancient military strategist Sun Tzu himself. For instance, Ukrainian forces constructed incredibly realistic wooden replicas of high-value targets, like the US-supplied HIMARS rocket launchers, and deliberately placed them where Russian drones would easily spot them. Predictably, Russian forces took the bait and wasted expensive caliber cruise missiles to destroy these worthless wooden launchers. Reports suggest that at least 10 Russian cruise missiles were completely wasted on these decoy targets. And seeing it work, Ukraine immediately ramped up production of even more dummy launchers to keep fooling the Russians. If there's one thing Ukraine forces excel at, it's quickly adapting to what works. When something proves effective, like suicide drones, drone-dropped caltrops, or decoy launchers, they double down, ramping up production and deployment. And if something doesn't deliver results, they waste no time in moving on to something else. On the other hand, the Russian forces keep going back to the one strategy they seem to know best: pulverize an area relentlessly with artillery, then send wave after wave of infantry to charge straight into it, often on foot. When that inevitably fails, their idea of innovation isn't to rethink their tactics. Instead, it's just to move these soldiers faster. Hence the motorcycles and ATVs, or simply throw even more men into the grinder. You'd normally expect a superpowers military, especially one with Russia's history, to show some creativity or adaptability under pressure. But Russia's approach throughout the Ukraine war has stayed painfully predictable, strictly by the book, and frankly, by the history book in all the worst ways. If you're worried about how AI is changing everything, jobs, industries, education, even the economy, well, you're not alone. According to a Rutgers University report, 7 in 10 US workers say they're very, or somewhat, concerned about employers using AI in decision-making. 3 in 10 are worried about their job being eliminated by AI. Even experts agree. Many studies say that by the 2030s, 30% of jobs will be automated by AI, and 44% of workers replaced. That means you have to pay attention if you want to avoid becoming a victim. That's why we recently made a YouTube video that breaks down what's actually happening behind the scenes and how people are preparing, not just to survive, but to benefit from the AI revolution. And this isn't about becoming a coder or building the next ChatGPT. It's about understanding where the real leverage is as AI evolves, and how normal people are using it to build safer career paths right now. If you're feeling uncertain about the future, or you're just curious about what your options are, watch that video here on YouTube by clicking on the link in the description or on the card on your screen. So why exactly is Russia struggling so badly to improvise or adapt? Well, it all boils down to military culture. The Russian army has always had a reputation for being extremely top-down in its command structure. Unlike Western militaries, where sergeants and junior officers are encouraged to think for themselves and quickly adapt to changing circumstances, Russian units often need approval from higher-ups for even minor tactical adjustments. If something unexpected happens, let's say you're a Russian soldier whose convoy suddenly runs straight into thousands of tiny invisible spikes scattered all over the road, your first instinct would naturally be to pull back, find a safer route, or at least send scouts ahead before moving forward. You'd instinctively do something, anything, to avoid getting yourself killed. But in the Russian army, you usually don't get that choice. Instead, you're stuck waiting for someone higher up to give new orders. And by the time those orders arrive, your unit has already suffered catastrophic losses. Another major problem is that the Russian military mindset has always valued sheer quantity and raw force over clever tactics or finesse. Even as late as 1912, the Russian Imperial Army's general staff taught only two maneuvers: advance and retreat, and often simply massed troops in thick columns to charge straight into enemy lines, despite horrific losses from artillery fire. Even during World War II, Soviet commanders often defeated German forces through sheer numerical advantage, accepting staggering losses as part of the process. Unfortunately for them, this brute force mentality hasn't changed much, even today. Just look at how Russia fought to capture Bakhmut. They spent 9 brutal months and tens of thousands of lives capturing just this one city. The same is happening at dozens of other strategic places across Ukraine. Sure, not every battle sees the same extreme 66-to-1 kill ratio we've witnessed around Torsk, but even ratios closer to 10-to-1 or 5-to-1 are still pretty devastating. Truth be told, in warfare, the attacking side almost always suffers heavier losses than the defenders. That's just how combat works. Military strategists know this, which is why textbooks usually advise having at least 3 attackers for every 1 defender, just to stand a chance at breaking through enemy lines. If you really want to guarantee success, that recommended number climbs to 4-to-1 or even higher. Because when you're defending, you pick the battleground. You fortify positions, you dig the trenches, you lay the ambushes, basically set up things exactly the way that you want. Meanwhile, the attackers have to move forward across open ground, often fully exposed and vulnerable, walking straight into enemy fire. This is exactly why attacking successfully requires exceptional planning, careful strategy, and constant improvisation on the ground. Every move has to be calculated. Every artillery strike, every infantry advance, every scouting mission needs to have a clear purpose. But the Russian commanders simply hadn't been doing any of this. That's why the results are predictably horrific. Because no matter how large your army might be, constantly losing 5, 10, or even dozens of soldiers for every enemy casualty is not just unsustainable. Eventually, numbers like that will bleed your forces dry. Unless Russia figures out how to counter Ukraine's creative and adaptive defenses, either by genuinely innovating new tactics, or by deploying overwhelming force far greater than anything they've managed so far, they face what's called culmination. That's the tipping point, where an army loses its ability to keep advancing, and eventually struggles to even hold on to territory it's already gained, because its combat strength has been brutally drained away. To be honest, many military analysts think Russia might already be dangerously close to that tipping point. And it's not just Bakhmut or Lyman. The Russians are running into the exact same problems further south and up north as well. For instance, further south, Ukraine's summer counteroffensive has been slowly gaining momentum. In late July, Ukrainian forces managed to recapture a key village called Staromayorska in Donetsk Oblast. It might seem small on a map, but Staromayorska sits right along the Mokry Yali River, making it a critical piece of Russia's first line of defense, especially where Donetsk Oblast meets Zaporizhia Oblast. Yet for some reason, they didn't bother seriously preparing until Ukraine openly announced its plans. Maybe it was sheer negligence? Or maybe pressure finally came down from above. But when Russia finally got moving, they ended up building some of the deepest, toughest defensive lines Europe has witnessed since World War II. They constructed huge networks of trenches, fortified bunkers, concrete tank traps, and dense, deadly minefields. On top of that, they had superior artillery and air support. So in theory, these fortifications should have made it impossible for Ukrainian forces to advance. Yet despite everything Russia threw at them, Ukrainian forces have been slowly but steadily breaking through, retaking village after village. By late July, they'd already liberated at least 14 villages scattered across Donetsk and Zaporizhia oblasts. Meanwhile, far to the north along this massive 1,000-kilometer front line, Russia tried launching its own offensive, particularly in Kharkiv Oblast and around Kupiansk, a key railway hub Ukraine had liberated back in the fall of last year. Ukrainian intelligence warned in August that more than 100,000 Russian troops had already been assembled in the Kupiansk-Lyman sector, along with hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces for a potential push. By mid-August, Russia ramped up attacks significantly, forcing Ukraine into heavy defensive action. Authorities ordered the evacuation of some 37 settlements in Kupiansk district, including the mandatory removal of thousands of civilians from villages close to the front. These evacuations were done both for civilian safety from increased shelling and to give the Ukrainian army more freedom of action to defend without endangering innocent lives. Leading this Russian push were groups called Storm Z units, mostly prisoners recruited straight out of jail and thrown into frontline assaults. Supported by tanks, attack helicopters, and heavy artillery fire, these assault teams tried repeatedly to break through Ukrainian defenses along the Oskil River and regain territory near Kupiansk. But just like elsewhere, despite Russia's huge buildup and aggressive pushes, they haven't managed any real breakthrough. Some frontline villages have changed hands multiple times within the same day. A trench or tree line seized by Russian forces at sunrise might be back under Ukrainian control by sunset. After nearly 4 years of warfare, nearly 1 million casualties, and endless mountains of wrecked equipment, they're still trapped in the same cycle of failure. So the question isn't just how much longer can Russia keep this up, but rather how much more can they afford to lose before they finally realize that overwhelming numbers and brute force just aren't enough to break a country that's fighting smarter, tougher, and more determined than they ever imagined possible.